And we are live. Welcome to the Slate Talk. My name is James McCool. I'm the owner of PaydirtDFS.com. This is going to be the NFL DFS Week 15 main slate talk. This is macro analysis and leverage. This is a podcast / stream / video that goes over kind of the important roster construction aspects of the slate and the most important decisions that you're going to make. This is not a 1v1 type show. This is not telling you to play X player over Y player. We do the bakery. That is Tribe and Jason on Fridays. This is much more how you should be building Beat the Field. Today, I'm going to be joined by Tribe of Shabazz, aka Tribe, and Pablo, aka Pablo. How are you guys doing today?
I'm good, bro. Just relaxing. Mad my daughter ate all of the curry chicken, so I was left without a plate, and I'm sad.
And Pablo has good internet today for the first time in probably his life. So how are you doing, Pablo?
Good internet. These are my next tier DraftKings headphones they gave me. So doing well.
Congrats on the new house, sir.
Thank you. Very nice to be in a newly built house with internet.
If you guys see my screen go dark, it's because I'm opening up different things on my screen. Pablo brought it up before this. I don't have a ring light. What you actually see when you see my face lit up like this is the dying suns that are in front of me. That is like 40 different screens with a whole bunch of different things on them. And as I change them, you'll see, different lighting. So that's what I've got going on. I'm not a professional at this, but nobody cares about my lighting setup. Everybody just wants the picks. Everybody wants to know how to win. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this. This looks like a pretty hard slate, all things considered. There are a couple things that could come through that will make things a little bit easier on us. We do have some injury designations. We have Bucky Irving, who is questionable. It sounds like he is going to play. If he were to be out, then we would have Rashad White, who I imagine would end up getting the bulk of that extra. But, outside of that, we really don't have that many really strong values to utilize at running back at the very least. At wide receiver, we do have a little bit of opened up, and at tight end, we have a little bit opened up, but not all that much. So this slate is relatively difficult. I'm excited to talk through it. Tribe, have you and Jason went through on the bakery on kind of like the player level stuff? Did anything stick out to you there?
Really what stuck out was, to your point, like the lack of value. I think it's just going to lead to a lot of balanced roster construction. I don't think you're going to see, outside of tight end, people reaching for many punt plays at the other skill positions.
Yeah, I think you're right. Pablo, you did a little write-up on things for the slate. What's kind of your high-level read here?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a hard slate. I mean, there's a lot of games, and the mantra when you have a lot of games has always been, for me and for a lot of folks, is to try to make the slate smaller, eliminate bad game environments, eliminate thinner plays. And I think you can do that to get down to a smaller player pool. But my player pool is still pretty large this week, even when I start to sort of whittle. And to your point and Tribe's point, there's not a whole lot of great value outside of a couple punt tight ends, and one of whose we can talk about is going to get a lot of ownership in LA. So that's going to lead to a lot of balanced builds. And I think one of the things we can talk about is what are the sheets and what are the sims telling us, or maybe some other ways to build with legitimate upside that maybe has a little bit of different roster construction. I think there's two ways to get edge on this slate. One is to try to build a little differently and get value in other ways, maybe through your quarterback. And then the other way is to play some lower owned games and correlate a little bit more given how large a slate is, and hope that you hit on a lower owned game environment that kind of shoots out. And I think we've got a couple of interesting candidates that meet that criteria, where they have a decent total, but don't seem that owned. Understanding you're going to give up a decent amount of median expectation because of how many sort of one-off plays and mini correlations people are going to be playing from other spots.
Yeah. It's usually where I want to start is going to be with stacks. And when I go and look at stacks, the main thing that sticks out to me here obviously is Cleveland. And Cleveland is going to look like a really good stack, mostly because of two reasons. One, they're cheap. It's only 16.7 to stack with Winston, Judy, and Elijah Moore because we don't have either of Cedric Tillman or David Njoku. And with both those guys out, this should be a really skinny target tree. It just makes sense that they would have that skinny target tree and that low price, and they would look good. The second thing, even though their median is only 49.27, which is fine, it's not a massive median, but it's fine. There's just not that many stacks that have a huge median on this slate, which is kind of weird because we have a lot of really good offenses on the slate. Like we have Cincinnati, we have Baltimore, we have Buffalo, we have Detroit. We have a lot of teams that have good team totals, but the medians just aren't that high. And I think that part of that is because there are just not that many super condensed offenses. Like even Baltimore spreads the ball out. Detroit spreads the ball out. They have their running backs that'll score a whole bunch as well. Buffalo spreads the ball out like crazy. Like Josh Allen absolutely nuked last week, and his highest scoring wide receiver was only like 22 fantasy points or something like that. It's Khalil Shakur. So we have a lot of offenses that are super spread out. The only one that is not spread out is Cincinnati, and that is why with a team total 26.5, they have the highest median at 54.07. So it's kind of a hard slate for somebody like me who just wants to look for teams to stack and make it easier on myself, because I really can't do that this week unless I'm willing to give up quite a bit of points in median. Pablo, I know that you talked a little bit about the game environments, and I mean, you have written down here, Bills Lions, massive total dome game, tricky one on how to play it. I agree with that because the Bills just, neither one of these teams is super condensed. Bengals Titans, which is another good game environment, but you have to assume that Tennessee wants to keep up, and we'll talk a little bit about the Cincinnati side of things as well, because the models want to do one thing and Tribe wants to do another. So there's an important thing there. Dolphins Texans, I'm surprised that game is not getting more attention. Pats Cards, gross. Bucks Chargers looks okay, depending on Lad McConkey. We have to wait on the news on that. And then, yeah, everyone else below 45 points. So we just, the game environments this week are a little bit weird, and I'm not finding much clarity on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so let's talk through this a little bit. So Bills Lions has a 54.5 total last time I checked. So it's got the highest total on the slate by 8 points. The next total is Bengals Titans with 46.5. Mm-hmm. What's tricky about it is two things. Number one, Josh Allen is expensive, and it's hard to figure out how to pair him. Do you play him naked? Do you play him with Khalil Shakir, who looks okay? Do you play him with Cooper, who got like a ton of targets last week? Is that a new thing, or is that just a 1 week thing? And then across that, do you pay up for Gibbs? Do you play Montgomery, who's, a lot cheaper, but not as cheap as some of the chalky value running backs? And do you focus on like JMO or Amon-Ra, who's really expensive? So I think the combination of who to play and how do you play them, it's like my initial inclination when I say, okay, 54.5 point total in a dome game was like, okay, we should probably just game stack that game, but you can't really do it. I mean, it's the pricing is hard enough without great punt value this week, where you sort of have to decide, like, are you gonna play contrarian Goff stack with JMO Amon-Ra or JMO Gibbs? I do think Jameson Williams is a very interesting high upside play. The Sims, last time I ran them, really liked him as an exposure to that game. So I think that's one way to get upside into that game without breaking the bank. But it's hard to sort of play that game heavily outside of one-offs or minis. Like it's just like hard to figure out how to really get into that game. And I think if you can figure out a way to play that game in a way that you can kind of game stack it a little bit more, you're probably going to be a little bit different, because I think people are mostly going to pick one or two of those guys and play it. The other thing you can do is just fade it and just say, you know what, like the pricing is hard enough where I hope I pick, I hope the game doesn't go crazy enough, and whoever I pick, or whoever I don't pick doesn't nuke enough to wipe out, whoever I do play. So it's a very long-winded way of saying I think it's a very tricky game to play. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on that game, because usually when we have a game with this high of a total relative to the other games, it becomes a real priority.
I somewhat disagree with that. I actually don't think it's that tricky to play it if you really want to. I just think people aren't going to. One, because none of those guys outside of like Josh Allen are popping like significantly, like just in general across the industry. The Sims don't really love any of those guys outside of Jameson Williams, right? Or Jameson Williamson, whatever, JMO. But you have Shakir, you have JMO, both of whom are mid-price receivers. The mid-tier receiver is going to be the chalk this week, just not them, right? And then we already have a punt tight end that's going to be chalk, which opens up the ability to play a spend up, right? The difference is based on ownership right now. The spend up that everyone is playing based on ownership is Jamar Chase. So you would just have to make that decision. Okay, instead of a mid-range quarterback and Jamar Chase, I'm just going to play Josh Allen and another mid-tier flex play. So from a roster construction standpoint, I think you can get there. It's just making those decisions that you have to wrestle with.
Yeah, and I think your point on Jamar Chase is an interesting one. And James, to dovetail with what you said when you were kind of doing an overview of the game environments, there is also a second decision to be made, which is if you're not playing Chase or Higgins for that matter, or a Burrow double, should you be playing Chase Brown? The Sims certainly think so. I mean, the Sims think Chase Brown is a great play. I actually love the play as well. I understand that the matchup isn't one necessarily that people feel is wonderful against Tennessee, but you get indirect leverage off of the pass game stack in Cincinnati, and you give yourself some money to spend up at either in Josh Allen or in some other form in your stack. So I think there's a couple interesting decisions to be made this week around some of the chalkier approaches. But that's a particularly important one, I think, is do you play the Cincinnati pass attack either in the form of Jamar Chase as a mini across Calvin Ridley or with Burrow, or do you not play him and just play Chase Brown?
I think that it's weird that people are prioritizing Jamar Chase over this Buffalo-Detroit game. Like, I understand that Amon-Ra St. Brown has not been incredible this year from like a median expectation standpoint. But at 13% owned in a game total of 54, like the reason why Amon-Ra St. Brown has not been producing is because they haven't fucking needed him to. Like they haven't been in enough game scripts where he has been a super important part of keeping them in games. And up against Buffalo, you would have to think that if there's going to be a game this year where Amon-Ra St. Brown is necessary for them to stay in a game, this is the game. And he's only 7,600, so he's cheaper than Jamar Chase and projected 13% ownership. I would not be surprised to see him come in higher than Jamar Chase tomorrow. I will say that. As we're having this conversation, I think that other people are likely also having a conversation of why the fuck aren't we just game stacking the 54.5 game total, right? But If they don't, that's awesome. I think that Amon-Ra St. Brown is a terrific play in all formats. And Tribe, to your point, it's not that hard to stack that game. I don't think, especially if you don't go Josh Allen. If you go Jared Goff at home in a huge game total, stack him with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams, bring it back with X, Y, or Z. I think that you're in a really, really good spot. And you absolutely can, I think, do a pretty massive stack there. Really quick, I did want to say, I wanted to answer a couple questions here. One, you're what up, boys? Just taking a break from playing things like AP mid Civer so that I can go play some DFS. Let's see. James, your IG modeling career will not take off without a ring light. That's absolutely fair. The good news is I never stood a fucking chance as an IG model anyway. This face is made for podcasting and for streams. I have enough good looks to go well on streams. Stacking has not worked. Time to adjust. That's absolutely not true. We've seen stacks win, I think, every single week so far this year. Now, the question has been whether it has been a single or a double stack or an overstack. We have not seen overstacks win very often this year. I think we have seen one overstack win. But keep in mind, 14 games, about 2 weeks worth of MLB. You can go 2 weeks in MLB without seeing the right kind of roster construction win every single year. We see 2 weeks of bullshit in MLB all the time. So, I disagree with that. I don't think that it's time to adjust. I think that we should probably just continue doing what we do, knowing that correlation matters. Burrow Brown stacks? No, probably not. I don't really see any reason to do that. Unless you think Tennessee is going to get absolutely routed, which they could, but I don't. On a slate like this, the reason why you play Chase Brown is one, he's a good play, and two, because it gives you leverage off Jamar Chase. I don't think that it's necessarily something that you want to get all three of them together. But if you think that the Bengals are just going to absolutely fuck over the Titans, then yeah, I think that's totally fair. Before I move on, I do think that Jameson Williams, when you look at the contest sims, like, he absolutely sticks out. If you're not going to play Cleveland, which the contest sims are saying you should absolutely play Cleveland stack, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But if you're not looking at those guys, he comes up with third highest exposure rate in winning lineups in the contest sims. Only projected for 10% owned. Everything is basically saying you should just be stacking Detroit with Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jared Goff, and bringing it back with Khalil Shakur or Amari Cooper.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the other thing we mentioned is that the Dolphins-Texans game, it looks like the sneaky unknown game. Nobody in that game is garnering ownership outside of maybe some Nico Collins. But it kind of makes sense because people are sort of saying, okay, I'm going to play Burrow stacks, or I'm going to try to figure out how to get Bills lines the way I like it. Kyler is going to be really popular. There's a lot of chalk in the Tampa Bay Chargers game in the form of Herbert and the punt tight end. Maybe the Bucky Irving news that he might be playing now will level out some of the ownership in that game because Rachaad White is not going to get a steam now. He may not be played at all probably at all if Irving's playing. And so the Dolphins-Texans game seems to be like kind of the overlooked game with high upside potential. The Sims also really like Stroud. So, you can play Stroud with Nico and Tank Dell, or you can play Dalton Schultz as a different sort of punt tight end and get your correlation there. So I think that's one really interesting way to go. It's like you either have to say, okay, I'm going to play that really high total upside dome game. I'm going to play a sneaky game in Dolphins Titans that has a high total, or I'm going to play a cheaper quarterback. That's the other point I wanted to make kind of macro wise, is that when I ran the stacks a couple hours ago and I sorted by 2x, like 11 or 12 out of the top 15 stacks in 2x were cheaper quarterbacks. Like it's like either Jameis Winston or Bo Nix or Drake May and then there's like a couple of stacks thrown in there of like, Will Levis or whatever. So anyway, to me, it's like you have to make first the decision is, am I going to pay up at quarterback or not? If I'm not, you can get a lot of value in your Winston stacks or in one of those other punts. And then the other question is, am I going to play into one of these lower owned total games? And the one that sticks out to me is Houston, Miami.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tribe, how do you feel about game environments overall?
I was actually shocked at some of the Vegas totals with some of these games. That Miami-Houston one being one that stood out. I thought that would have came in higher than it did. Somewhat shocked that Cleveland is as low as it is, just given how they've been playing and their passing volume. So there's some spots that I think if people are just going based off totals are definitely going to get overlooked. But I feel like there's still upside there. And outside of the outlier, obviously, with the Detroit-Buffalo game, I don't feel that the range of outcomes as far as like game totals is really that wide to the point that you need to necessarily start crossing games off if you think a team, like Cleveland, right, is one of those great examples. It's a condensed target tree. We know Jameis is going to throw 35 plus times. So, if you just want to bank on opportunity and price there, it makes perfect sense regardless of, what Vegas has the team total as.
Yeah, Cleveland, at 20.5, I think the main thing on that is that Kansas City's defense is good.
Yes.
And Kansas City is good at maintaining time of possession. That's the big thing. Cleveland, when they're out there, they're going to throw the ball a lot. But the volume may be mitigated by Kansas City defense and by their ability to maintain the time of possession. That being said, as we are talking about, like, these teams, they are not condensed, they're spread out, they have good totals, but who do we play? I think that one thing that you probably should consider doing, what I'm considering doing, is Cleveland stacks, which are very condensed, and then filling in with the high total players and ringers from other teams. Right? So something like Cleveland with Amon-Ra St. Brown, bring it back with Khalil Shakur, and then, stack around and use your running backs the best that you can. And then that's a lineup, right? Or do a Cleveland stack with, Jamar Chase and Calvin Ridley or whatever. Like just start with a Cleveland stack that is super condensed and that is super condensed, and just live and die by that sword. We can all be Jameis Winston hoping that he is delivered from pick sixes, and just hope that we end up winning that way. Or the other thing that you can do, because that offense is so condensed, I think that you can use Judy and Elijah Moore together without Jameis Winston. And basically just say, okay, well, there's a very real possibility that both Judy and Elijah Moore end up with like 35% of the targets each, 100 yards and a touchdown, and that doesn't win you a GPP with Jameis Winston. But because the offense is so condensed, they are cheap and they offer a lot of upside as two relatively inexpensive plays and really good values. Pairing them together, which allows you to then get to a Josh Allen or get to a Lamar Jackson or whatever. I think that that's kind of an interesting way to go about it. If I thought that Cleveland stacks were going to be popular, I would actually say that would be my preference, because I think you could get away from Winston ownership in that combination and go with Judy and Elijah Moore alone without him. But Pablo, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that strategy, because I think that it does open up a lot of upside to be played around if you are aiming to get maybe a skinny stack, but would rather do it with, Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two components, right? Two parts of this. The first, how do we feel about like a low owned stack with a condensed target tree, and then filling it in with some of the chalkier pieces around it? I like that idea a lot. I think that we have repeatedly said this year, since like week 6 or 7 onwards, that your running back chalk has just like generally been good enough for the most part, where you're not going to really find that much edge in trying to play a different running back, right? And this week, when we look at the top owned running backs, they all look like basically every week there's like 4 or 5 guys. This week it's Chase Brown, James Conner, Rico Dowdle, Chuba Hubbard. B-Rob's like a little bit less owned. There's gonna be some Joe Mixon ownership. And then there's a bunch of guys that are whatever. I don't have a huge issue with any of that chalk. Sims don't particularly love Chuba Hubbard. So if you want to pick on one, I guess you could pick on him. His usage is tremendous. They're favorites, and the Cowboys are kind of dead. So I don't have a huge problem with it. But the reason I bring that up is because I'm not going to be looking to get super different at running back. So how do I get different? I mean, I need some leverage. So the way you get leverage is you say, okay, I'm going to play a stack that won't be quite as owned. And to your point, if you get enough leverage with your stack, you can eat plenty of your chalk with your running backs, especially if you've saved enough money where you can pay up to a contrarian receiver like Amon-Ra or one of those guys. So I like that idea. I don't know that. I mean, I think some of this is field size dependent. For me as a single entry, 300 to 400 field size player, occasionally, I'll probably play one lineup in the slightly larger double spy that's like 800 entries, still single entry. If I'm going to play Judy and Moore, I'm going to play Winston with them anyway, because I don't feel the need to. If they're going to get there, it's fine with me. For larger field, I think I'm more okay with playing those receivers without the quarterback. For smaller field, I think you just take the correlation and you're happy if they both get there enough so that you can beat the field. But my bigger point here is just that you kind of have to decide where you're going to get your leverage. And I don't think this week is any different than the majority of this year, which is to say that most of the running back chalk is fine. And so you need your leverage in the form of your stack/receivers. That's where you're going to get your leverage. And so we're all looking for either a game environment or a stack with a condensed target tree that allows us to get the leverage in your pass game to win the GPP. And I think Cleveland's there. I think Houston's in there. Maybe Miami, Detroit. To your point with Goff, if that's the way you want to approach that game, is there. So to me, that's kind of like the macro thinking behind how I'm so far approaching this sort of tricky slate.
I do want to point out really quick on the just playing the running back chalk. I actually think Chuba Hubbard is really bad chalk. Like from a median standpoint and from a here's who else you can play, I don't actually think that Chuba Hubbard is good chalk whatsoever. I'm fine playing him. I'll clarify that. Like whatever. If you want to get chalk on that, like running back has been a spot that has not been super volatile. Like you've been able to win with chalk. I totally agree with all your points on that. But when you run the pivot finder with pretty tight constraints, 300 acceptable salary range and 3 median fantasy points, you get Breece Hall versus Jacksonville. Breece Hall is very likely in. You get James Conner versus New England, who is coming in at 66% of the ownership of Chuba Hubbard, like 2/3 of the ownership. You get Brian Robinson versus New Orleans, who's coming in at 13% owned. You get Tony Pollard, who has had just as good of a role as Chuba Hubbard on the other side of that Cincinnati game as a leverage piece. And you get James Cook in a team total or in a game total of 54.5. Now, granted, he has the lowest median of all of those guys, lowest floor because Josh Allen exists. But like, I don't know, man. I think that while Chuba Hubbard has been fine, he's been good. I think that him and James Conner have basically been the exact same running back for the vast majority of the year. I do not think that he's actually deserving of 30. He's going to be like 35% owned. And on the other side of that game, like if I expanded out this salary range to 500, you would see Rico Dowdle, who's projecting at like 19% owned and has had just as good of a role, is $400 cheaper, and is on the other side in the nuts running back matchup against Carolina, where I don't know. I don't see any reason if if I can, at the very least, start with James Conner and Nico Dowdell over Chuba Hubbard and clip off 30% of the field, I'm going to do that this week. I can still eat a lot of ownership at running back because James Conner is going to be owned and Rico Dowdell is going to have ownership. They should both be like 20%, but they're not going to be like 35% owned like Chuba Hubbard is going to be. All of this said, because I know that we're going to talk about Sims here in a second, there is a very real possibility that the Sims point this out and then Rico Dowdell ends up 25% owned, Chuba Hubbard ends up 23% owned, and James Conner at 6,600 ends up like, 26% owned. And they're all the same ownership and you don't gain anything on them. That's absolutely fair. Even then, I still think that Chuba Hubbard as one of the highest owned players on the slate, I don't think that it's worth a lot.
I'll give you one more reason, and it's very analogous to the Cincinnati situation, which is that if you don't play Chuba Hubbard, you can also play Thielen.
Yeah.
And Thielen looks wonderful at his price and his usage. So, and by the way, he's not sneaky to your point. And maybe I think the hard thing about this year, and I saw somebody, Shrek, tweeted at you, James, and said this, is that like the game theory this year has had to take one more step, which is that last year it was, what do the Sims think? And kind of just like, you could just do that. This year you have to do, okay, here's what I think, here's what the Sims think. And because this is what the Sims think, how do I think the lineups are actually going to look different than what were projected, because everyone's going to do what the Sims think. And then, and it's made it a little more challenging. And to that point, to your point on fading Chuba to get some relative ownership benefit in the form of Dowdle or Connor or any one of those guys we just mentioned, you're right. Like, I think there's a decent chance that the Sims are going to actually level out the ownership across the board there. And people are going to be like, wait, why am I playing Chuba Hubbard at 38% when I can play Dowdle at 25%? And they both ended up like 30%. And that's why, honestly, that's why running back chalk this year, like, just hasn't mattered that much, because that's what's kind of happened every week. But Tribe, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if you go into like our Sims and you look at the exposure percentages. I wouldn't be surprised to see the ownership more closely mirror what the exposure percentages are than what we have as the projected ownership, which right now basically has like all of them like between 20 and 25%. Like, that being said, if you've listened to any episode of the Bakery this week, I have been on team mid-range running back pretty much the whole season. Like, just start your build, pick two of these guys at your running back positions and move on with your construction. Similar thoughts, like get different with stacks. There's really no reason, unless you want to get super contrarian. Like, if you go with the cheap Winston Cleveland stack, like, you have enough. If you wanted to go up to like a Saquon Barkley, you could. But we just haven't seen, for the most part, that outlier performance from these high-end running backs warrant the spend up there.
And James, I'm curious. I mean, one of the reasons I think mathematically, not to get too nerdy, but for 1 minute to get nerdy about this, part of the reason I think that what Tribe just said is true is because of if you visualize the range of outcomes for a player like on a graph, right? And their median is right in the middle. And some players have like a pretty, like it kind of goes like this. It stays in the middle for a little bit, it goes back down, and then it tails off, right? Mm-hmm. So first of all, that's mostly running backs. And those running backs all have like relatively close ownership to each other. And the chalk running backs are all like 20 to 30%. Mm-hmm. Occasionally we get like people like last week where like Kamara or whoever who are 35, 40, but this week it looks more like the 20 to 35% range. Then you have receivers who, to begin with, all have ownership in like the 8 to 15% range, maybe a couple approaching 20. So to begin with, the receivers there's more of them, and they all have more diluted ownership. And then on top of that, while their median might actually be shifted to the left and be lower, they have a longer tail outcome. And because of that, I think that's where we've been saying, hey, get your leverage in your receivers. And there's just a ton of pivots at receiver this week. There's people, there's like 35, there's like 40 receivers between 4,500 and 7K that are all like find a good place. And I'm not saying it's a crapshoot, but I think that's where you should be putting a lot of your thought into. Because I just like that's where you're going to get the best bang for your buck in terms of your leverage.
Yeah.
So just to speak to the math part of that really quick, I did just kind of talked quite a bit about it with Sheets when I was talking about the distributions for NHL, going into the seed frame tech and talking a little bit about how modeling out for NHL, a lot of people make mistakes when they model out for NHL and that they use something closer to a normal distribution when you really can't. With NHL, you really have to use something that's closer to a bimodal or truncated distribution. And so what we see in NFL is kind of a mix. You end up with these truncated distributions that have weird tails, which you start with like a normal distribution is just like that bell curve that everybody knows of. And a truncated distribution means that middle leans one way or the other, right? So you end up leaning towards the 0 range for NFL. So you have this higher slope for NFL, and then you tail off, and then you have a couple bumps in your tails towards the ceiling. And running backs, so the skinniest distribution is always QBs. That's skinniest distribution. And then the second skinniest is running backs, and then the third is tight end, and then the longest distribution, the widest distribution is always wide receivers. And that's why the variance, it's better to eat variance at wide receiver because the distributions are much wider and the tails are much wider. So you have a lot more variance and a lot more ways to fail as a wide receiver. That's why fading quarterbacks doesn't really do anything for you, because even if you fade a quarterback outcome of 24 fantasy points, it's very likely that you faded them for a quarterback who had an outcome of like 19 fantasy points most of the time. The distribution difference just doesn't win you a GVP unless you're Josh Allen, which of course is why Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson are very valuable. But with all that said, that's why these mid-range running backs have been so valuable, is because you're just playing a running back that gets somewhere between 18 and 25 fantasy points most of the time, and that's just what you do. And it's why last week, when we had a $4,800 running back that was going to be a bell cow, he should have been 80% owned, because he should have been 6,600, 7K, and he wasn't. So he needed to be super high owned. Him and Guarendo were both like, you gain basically the equivalent of a mid-range wide receiver in value distribution there by getting both of those guys. So those kind of things are to your point, it's very nerdy to think through, but it is good context as to how this kind of stuff should work. Tribe, I kind of cut you off there, so sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, similar to that, right? You also get just wider distribution, I think, in terms of projected ownership as well, right? We talked about these mid-range running backs all being within that 20% range, but having similar outcomes. Whereas receivers, you're going to get guys with similar medians, similar ceilings, but one guy is going to project for like 15% owned and one guy's going to project for 5. So the relative leverage you get with that is also just greater. I've mentioned this a few times in the Discord, but the leverage or the pivot play in GPPs is not really fading the 30% guy for the 25% owned guy. It's fading the 20% owned guy for the 8% owned guy.
Right. Yeah. And that goes back to the Chuba Hubbard thing. Like I said, you can play him. It's fine. It doesn't really matter. But especially if he's you can especially play him if he's going to be 31% owned and Rico Dowdell ends up 25% owned. You didn't gain anything by getting off him for Dowdell. However, if he does end up getting steamed up even farther and he's 35% owned and Dowdell stays at 20%, that's still a very good pivot to make. I wanted to say really quick, we have a lot of focus on Josh Allen. We have a lot of focus on Joe Burrow. You know who we don't have focus on? Is Lamar Jackson. And now I certainly recognize that they're up against the Giants. And the Giants suck dick. They are by far the worst team in the league. They have been the worst team in the league all year. They have been the worst team in the league in the recent sample. They are a dick-sucking machine from the future. They're really bad. But the Ravens have an implied total of 30. The highest on the slate, in fact. And the vast majority of what their scoring is going to come from is either Lamar Jackson or Derrick Henry. Neither is actually getting much ownership. Like neither one of them. You go to running back range of outcomes and you sort by median here. And Derrick Henry at 16% owned as like a 40-point favorite against the Giants. I am willing to bet that one of Lamar Jackson or Derrick Henry puts up 30 fantasy points and wins the GPP this week, because why wouldn't they if they're implied to score 30 real life points as a team? And it's usually not just 30 real life points. Usually what ends up is they end up in the 35 to 40 point range, in which case this is the most Derrick Henry runs for 220 yards and 3 touchdowns game that we have seen all year. And he's going to be 15% owned. So I really like Derrick Henry this week.
Yeah, and he's not going to be very owned. I mean, everyone's going to be playing that mid-range running back play. I mean, if Henry nukes, I mean, he does have that separation ability. To your point before, I mean, maybe, and it's not related to Lamar, but just to go back for a second to Detroit. I mean, Detroit stacks with Goff, J-Mo, and your choice of Amon-Ra or Gibbs, because I do think you compare Gibbs with Goff across Cooper. And even if you want to and get crazy and just fully game stack it, Cooper and Shakir, it's actually pretty doable.
It is.
I think if you're playing smaller field and you've got like 3 to 5 lineups, I think you're sort of like obligated to have a game stack in that game. Anyway, I just want to point that out because Goff right now is projecting for like close to 0 ownership, and it's just one of those classic just play the opposite side spots, and it's not really hard to do.
I want to also piggyback on that. When you run using ETR optimals, if you run 150 with no rules, you do not get any Goff or Josh Allen. You don't get, like, I'm running through the exposures right now. You get a lot more Brian Thomas at 5,800 than you do Jameson Williams. In fact, I don't think that you get a single Buffalo or Lions player in the optimals at all. Not a single one. You also do not get any Derrick Henry. You get 0. You get 100% Chuba Hubbard, though. So this slate shapes up as a very easy. We should probably just play teams that are implied to score points.
What was that week where it was Detroit and no one was playing them, and I was like screaming in the Discord, "Why are we not stacking?"
Yeah, that was the week we did the Slate Talk with. That was 2 weeks ago. We did the Slate Talk with
Scott Barrett.
Scott, yeah. And I was like, "How do we play this game? The medians are so bad." And Scott was like, "The industry just is tired. It's already been kind of like a long season. There's been a lot of injuries to deal with. And people are just like getting lazy with projections. And also everyone's so focused on median. And I mean, that is maybe where the Sims, again, reacting to the Sims. Like if your inputs to the Sims have really bad relative value for the high total games, which as James has pointed out, ETR as like one of the industry standards, and I don't know what Stoke or the other or RunPure or whatever think, but I'm sure they're similar. If the high total games have bad relative value, then your Sims are not going to play a lot of players from those games unless there's a mispriced player. So maybe we should just say like fuck your median and play players from that game, and you just have to accept that when you hit project, when you run your lineups and you look at your median, you're going to see like a 8 to 10 point hit on your median. Like your median, like a typical median, if you're using like a more optimal approach, is going to be around like 141 points, like in the low 140s. And a typical median for one of these games, if you're game stacking or whatever, is going to be closer to like 133. And you just have to say, like, I don't give a shit, like, because these are the games that are going to go off.
Yeah. I'm sold now at this point. I know exactly what I'm going to build tomorrow. Like this slate, and that's the thing. That's why this podcast specifically is so valuable. Is I went into this saying, man, this is kind of a tough slate. We all did. All three of us did going into this thinking this slate is kind of tough. And after talking through it and actually really working through the slate dynamics and what you can do and what you can afford and where we should be focusing, it's like, okay, well, now it's super simple. Like we should probably just be stacking Detroit and using Derrick Henry. Like that seems pretty simple to me. Just stack teams and take running backs in spots where they're huge favorites, and that probably makes a lot of sense. So I agree with you to an extent, Pablo. The only thing that I would say is that medians typically do take into account team totals. The hard part, and the reason why I say medians this week are relatively low, say on Buffalo and Detroit, is because those offenses are spread out. I mean, you do take risks, even if we overstack it, right? Like, even if that game does score 54 real-life points, game stacking with 5 players doesn't even guarantee that you get 75% of the scoring. Both of those teams could distribute touchdowns to 5 different players on each team. That's not easy to stack and feel good about. But if you are going to build out a portfolio or MME or have like 10 lineups, then it becomes significantly easier to then not cover all your bases, but cover the bases of that game, at the very least, and take a big stand, which I think is something that is worth doing tomorrow. Somebody like Jason, who's going to max out, a lot of the 20 maxes and stuff like that. He should probably be focusing on that Detroit game and that game environment and trying to circle around those bases. But good points overall. There was another spot that I kind of wanted to think through a little bit, because I do think that it's worth thinking about. With no George Pickens for Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, that game could be really shitty, because Philadelphia could just get out to a lead and then they wouldn't have to do anything in the fourth quarter, blah, blah, blah. But Pittsburgh has been good this year. I do think that Pittsburgh is a good enough offense to push Philadelphia a little bit. And nobody has any focus whatsoever on those games. A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts are apparently like not friends anymore because A.J. Brown's not getting a workload or whatever. Like, there's squeaky wheel narratives. It's 2 good offenses, efficient offenses at the very least. Like, I think that there's probably something to be said about looking for mini stacks in there. And A.J. Brown bringing it back with a Pat Freiermuth, something like that, right? Like, I maybe it's Stockholm syndrome. I've been playing a lot of A.J. Brown, and I just think that he's under-owned every single week. And even when we go and we look at the medians, like, even when you maintain that his median, that his workload is relatively low, he still projects pretty well in 16.04. Granted, not near as well as a couple of these other guys. We should talk about Cortland Sutton here in a second too. But are you guys just completely off Philadelphia here? Am I insane?
I don't think you're. Go ahead. You go first, Tribe.
I don't think you're insane. Like, for how you think analytically, right? Like, that's your thing. It makes sense, because looking at that stuff, it bears witness to that. Just from like a narrative, and I know, like, I love Tomlin. I think he's a great coach, but both him and Sirianni, they're kind of meatheads. They're like old school, like, football coaches. I think like one of them even said like, oh, this is like an old school Battle Philadelphia or Battle of Pennsylvania type of game. And so, especially without George Pickens, I don't know what the hell is going on with Philly's passing offense, to your point, but like the beef or whatever nonsense, the tiff, the kerfuffle between Hurts and AJ Brown, we could just also see 60 combined rush attempts between like Najee Harris and Saquon Barkley. I do think there's weapons on this team. If I were doing 10 or more lineups, I do think having exposure to AJ Brown makes a ton of sense given what his ceiling is. I think having, a little bit of exposure to Saquon Barkley makes a ton of sense. Russ has been cooking. We've been talking about how there's not a lot of value. I haven't looked at the pricing on those receivers, like who's left without George Pickens, but I imagine they're not expensive. So, someone like Calvin Austin, who has been like a solid, cheap option, even when Pickens has been in. I definitely agree. I wouldn't stack either side. I do think mini stacking would be the way to go, especially because there's some interesting high upside, low owned options available in that game for sure.
Yeah, my feeling is that this is like an interesting week to think about how you build depending on the field size and the limit or lack thereof entry. Tribe just is choking, so hopefully he'll be okay.
Dude just fucking dies on stream. That'd be crazy. 232 people just watched this man die on stream.
Died and came back, baby.
All right, P Tribe. So, anyway, I think field size here is like interesting. I mean, for larger fields, I'm more with it. For smaller fields, I just think it's a little too out there. I mean, I think this is this feels like a bit of a first or last week to me. I mean, like we're gonna. The thing with NFL is you get if you play the game theory the right way, you eventually get rewarded. And to your point before, James, on sample size, like it can take like 2 to 3 seasons or even 4 or 5 seasons to really see that benefit because there's just not enough slates. But the whole thing with NFL is like leaning into the direct or indirect leverage and the lower owned spot. So like this week, what we're saying is lean into the dome game, like lean into it. Don't pussyfoot around it and play 1 or 2 guys and mini stack it. Like fucking game stack it, right? Lean into some of the lower owned game environments. To your point, like I think for larger field, for example, yeah, I mean, Eagles for like 10,000 plus fields, yeah. Same with Houston, Miami. Same with Jameis doubles. And then I think the decisions you make is just how much. People often say, like, did I not eat enough chalk? And like, it's kind of a hard question to answer. Like the answer is usually if your field size is small and you've already got a lot of leverage, eating more leverage you can, but there's this balance between cash equity and win equity, right? And at some point, you're not getting enough win equity for the diminishment in your cash equity. I think it's the easiest way to think about it. So, but for larger field where you need the pure nuts, like you can really, like for the milli maker, you can never really have too much leverage, right? For a single entry 300-man contest, like you kind of can have too much leverage because you can sort of, you just don't need to get that wild. After if you're playing a Jameis Winston double, like you have enough leverage already. Like you eat some fucking running back chalk, play like a leveraged receiver, and that's it. That's all you have to do. Like you're trying to beat 300 people, right? So yeah, I mean, if we go back to the game environments, just to kind of circle back, Bills Lions massive total dome game. We're saying lean into it. Bengals Titans. Burrow stacks actually have like last time I ran the Sims looked like kind of negative leverage, and that's in line with Chase Brown looking like positive leverage. I'm with that, and I'm not saying you can't win with Burrow doubles. He might do fine, but I prefer the Chase Brown side. Dolphins Texans we haven't really talked about. but will be low owned. And I think the trouble with Dolphins Texans is that it's kind of hard to prioritize that over Bills Lions. Like it's if you're only playing like 5 lineups, you know, maybe you play at least one of each. But if you're only playing 2 or 3, like I don't think you're playing Dolphins Texans over Bills Lions. I don't think you are. If you're playing 10, I think you're probably playing 1 or 2 Dolphins Texans, you know, stacks. Bucks Chargers, I don't know. Herbert looks chalky. White being Irving probably playing lowers ownership, not quite as chalky as it might be. I think we should talk about Smart for 1 second, and I'll circle back to that after. Actually, this is a good time to talk about it. So Smart is at tight end. There's 2 chalky tight ends. It's Smart, who's the punt tight end. The little blurbs I've read about the guy is that he's like some jack receiver who plays tight end, and he's likely to get a really good role. Just be aware, like he's going to be, 35% in small field. And you have Brenton Strange, who on the sheets looks just as good as him, if not better, at not unknown, but like significantly lower ownership, right? So there's a direct pivot in Strange in terms of price. And then the other one is McBride. McBride has been an absolute beast this year. He looks pretty chalky. I'll just say that one of my favorite plays on the slate, and it's not sneaky, so whatever, but given McBride will be chalky and given Kyler will be chalky, James Conner sticks out because I like McBride and I like Kyler for that matter. They both look like fine chalk plays in the Sims, but I think you can also just play James Conner and call it a day from that game. And you can play Hunter Henry across him if you want. So those are kind of the game environments I think we're talking about. And then the only other one we mentioned was the Browns double, just because it's such a condensed target tree. And is there anything there with weather? That's the only thing. Like Gordy said in Discord that he said 2 things. One, he said that one of the Chiefs' offensive linemen is out, and it makes the Browns' punt defense more viable. And then somebody, I don't know if it was Gordy or somebody else, replied to him saying also there could be weather in that game, which also makes like defenses more interesting when there's wild weather.
Yeah.
Is that
so left tackle Humphreys is out, which left tackle obviously is massive. And then Jason added in.
When you've got what's his face across him, right? Like you have
Myles Garrett.
Yeah, they'll put Myles Garrett over there.
He's a game breaker, right?
Yeah.
So that makes an interesting thing too. What if you played Nick Chubb at 5,500? Pair it with the Browns D. That's not bad. I mean, if they're in the lead, then they'll just feed Nick Chubb, especially down in all those wide receivers. That would make sense. I could buy that.
I think it's fine. I'm still like just so comfortable with Rico Dowdle and James Conner and even Chuba if you have enough leverage, or B-Rob, that like I don't feel the need to get too different at running back, but I don't have a huge problem with it. I just feel like any one of, like we said, they're all interchangeable to some degree. Yeah. I'm just looking for my quarterback receivers to be different.
Well, I just built the winner, so I'm.
Let me ask you guys one more thing. If you're not playing Winston, and this is more of a large field question because I really don't think in smaller field. Well, I could be wrong. I mean, maybe it is a smaller field consideration. Are you, to my point at the very beginning, the 2x stack numbers, and even if you just go to quarterback and forget the stacks, like 11 or 12 or whatever, the top 15 are cheaper quarterbacks. It's like there are variations of Jameis Winston or Knicks or Drake May. Are you guys more interested in that to get your pay up money for Derrick Henry or for Amon-Ra St. Brown or Gibbs? Or are you more interested in just getting up to Lamar or Josh Allen? I'm like, where do you guys think you'll be? I'll just tell you, I think I'll be in the. I don't know that I'll get all the way down to. I'll probably have one Jameis lineup just because the Sims and the sheets like him so much. But I'm also just fine with like Herbert, Kyler Murray, and even Jared Goff at 6,500, who for all the reasons we've already mentioned. I don't think I'm going to get up to Lamar or Josh and or even Joe Burrow for that matter. And that's life. But I just think that I'd rather spend up at flex positions. But what do you guys think you're going to do?
Tribe, I'll let you go first on that.
Yeah. So of those guys you mentioned, I do like Knicks because I like Sutton. We didn't talk about Sutton, but he projects like God in the range of outcomes. I'm probably more inclined this week than I have been pretty much all season to try and spend up a little bit. And part of that is because all of these mid-range guys look good. Like you can afford them, right? Like even if I stack Cleveland, the receivers are affordable. Even if I stack, Kyler, like McBride and Marvin Harrison, who's been priced down, are all affordable. Like all of their options within these stacks outside of the Burrow stack, for the most part, all of these guys are mid-range receivers, which I would be playing mid-range receivers in like that 5 to 6K range in a Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson build anyways. So like I can still get exposure that way. Even Zay Flowers, if you skinny stack Lamar, Zay Flowers is priced down to 6K. So yeah. I actually don't think it's an either or discussion this week.
I think I'm probably going to stack down. Probably because I do have a lot of interest in a Derrick Henry and in that really expensive game environment for the Detroit side of things. And I have interest in, not playing Stone Smart. Like I'm fine with him, but I think that I have interest in playing somebody like Trey McBride or somebody, a little bit more expensive, Pat Freiermuth, something like that. But I'm not quite sure. I do think that you can still get there with Jared Goff, which I have no reason not to do that. But we'll see. I do think that Cleveland stacks, I think, make a lot of sense. My only concern there is if I'm going to play Cleveland stacks, I want that game to be relatively competitive. I don't want them to just be able to hand the ball to Nick Chubb 20 times and have that be fine. And it does seem like Cleveland is or Kansas City is kind of in shambles right now. Like it would make plenty of sense for them to just kind of punt this game, knowing that they get Hollywood Brown back after this week, and kind of start trying to get healthy for the playoffs. They don't have to win any more games, right? Like they've won plenty of games. They don't have to win anymore. Everything on top of this now at this point is just kind of gravy. So that would be my only concern. But I do have a lot of interest in either Cleveland or Nick Chubb because I do think that there's going to be some points scored by Cleveland in that game. But I do want to try to get to Lamar Jackson. I don't think I want to try to get to Josh Allen. I'm fine with Jared Goff on the other side. But I do think that I want to try to get to Lamar Jackson if I'm not going with Derrick Henry, just because with a team total of 30, one of Lamar Jackson or Derrick Henry is scoring 30 fantasy points. I'm like positive of that. And with the amount of non-value on this slate, that is going to be a significant score to overcome from any position. So I do think that both of them are valuable. It just kind of depends on as I'm building out. I think the only way to get to Lamar Jackson is going to be utilizing Stone Smart and Nick Chubb and Elijah Moore if I'm going to try to do that. And even then, like I'm going to have to give up something somewhere else to make it happen. So we'll see how I build tonight. But I do think that this is going to be a slate where, if a player scores 30 or more fantasy points, you're going to need them. So I kind of want to try to get exposure to guys who can give me that 30-plus fantasy point realistic outcome.
Are you stacking Lamar Jackson if you play him? Oh, sorry.
Say that again?
I was just asking. Yeah, I was just asking if you were going to stack Lamar Jackson if you play him, like in those lines.
Yeah, I would skinny stack. It would either be Zay Flowers or Mark Andrews if I go that route. And Mark Andrews, I think, would be fine because then that's going to get me over the Stone Smart people as well. If Mark Andrews has a 2-touchdown game and Lamar Jackson runs one in, then that combo right there is going to be worth, 50-something fantasy points. And I think that's going to be really hard to overcome with how much ownership is going to be on Stone Smart at tight end. So
let me ask you guys about just before, and we should also see if anyone has questions, but and I understand that none of these receivers are that owned, but I still think they're owned enough that it's worth bringing them up. We've talked about like the chalkiest receivers for the most part. We talked about Jamar Chase. It's just pricey, and I don't know that you like that's where you need to get your upside this week. Also, by the way, like primetime bias, right? Like just went crazy on primetime, which always drives ownership more. But the other, and then we talked about Elijah Moore, who unfortunately is not that sneaky, but looks like really good value. I do think it would be really funny if T. Higgins went off this week and like after everyone played him several weeks in a row, and he even like tweeted like I know. But we haven't mentioned a couple guys that I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on, and I have a feeling you're going to say they're fine. Range of outcomes think they're fine, not like outlierish, good or bad, just fine. One is BTJ. Brian Thomas Jr. in Jacksonville looks like right now I'm seeing him as the chalkiest, at least at ETR. And then you guys mentioned Cortland Sutton. And then the other one I wanted to ask you about was Calvin Ridley, because he's an interesting mini across, if you do play the Bengals pass game or if you play Chase Brown. So do you guys have any thoughts on the how strong or not strong Brian Thomas Jr., Calvin Ridley, and Cortland Sutton are?
Yeah, Cortland Sutton projects like a god. If you go to Fantasy Life, which plug as usual, I provide a lot of data for them, and I think they do a really, really good job. If you go and look at wide receivers since week 8, like Cortland Sutton is the second best wide receiver in the league. In terms of production, in terms of usage, in terms of his role, he is getting it. If you look at him versus somebody like Jamar Chase, 99% route participation versus 91, 27 for TPRR, 30% target share. Cortland Sutton is getting better targets, 82% catchable, 13.2 ADOT, which is higher than Jamar Chase, like 44%. His role for the Broncos has been terrific. He's just underpriced. That there's not anything more to say about it. Over at Paydirt, we have him projected at 18.22, and he's 6,600. That when you sort this just straight up by median, him and Jerry Jeudy are just sore thumbs in this top group. They're $1,000 underpriced each, at least. So I think that both of them are terrific plays. Brian Thomas Jr. He is good, and I think that he is probably also a bit underpriced, but not near to the point of Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton. Those guys were just at another level. So I really like Jerry Jeudy. I really like Cortland Sutton. And again, it just kind of comes down to with Cortland Sutton, I would be fine playing him as a one-off. With Jerry Jeudy, I would also be fine playing with him as a one-off. However, I don't want to play Jerry Jeudy and Nick Chubb together. That bothers me a little bit, especially with what I think is a low-ish team total of 20.5. Would like to not play them together. So it really hinges on how my lineup construction comes out. But I'd much rather play somebody like Jerry Jeudy or Cortland Sutton over the vast majority of wide receivers on this slate.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Tribe?
Yeah, so I talked about this last week on the Bakery as well. I just kind of went through like my own personal process with how I've been building this year, which, for the most part has been decent for me in terms of the return. But it's identifying these receivers who are just underpriced relative to their role. So clearly, like James mentioned, Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton. But ideally I try and find like guys in that 5K range. And so like last week, for example, that ended up being it was a combination of Jennings, Jacoby Myers. Oh, Jerry Jeudy was still like he was like $1,000 less last week, which was stupid, right? They finally corrected the pricing somewhat, but he's still too cheap, right? And so I'm probably going to have one of Brian Thomas Jr. or Calvin Ridley in every single one of my lineups, just because that's personally how I've been like kind of starting my builds. Like I'm going to eat mid-range running backs. I'm going to find one of those receivers who is a wide receiver one on their team, and just the pricing hasn't caught up to the fact that they have wide receiver one role and potential upside. And then if I can find a cheap tight end, which we've talked about this week, there's, even if you're not playing the duel from the Chargers, there's a few other cheap tight ends you can go to, and really just doing that, and then building out my stacks that way. And over the course of the season, we've just seen similar constructions to that just continue to be profitable week after week. So
yeah. We can probably answer a couple questions here as we're shutting things down. We're a little over an hour here. So we have one here from Ike. Since we know Buffalo's run defense is basically a wet paper towel and are not concerned that the whole game plan will basically be Demon Gibbs, it for sure could be. We mentioned that when it comes to the distribution of scoring for those teams, they are both very, very wide. There's 10 players that could score a touchdown in that game, and you wouldn't be surprised. There's 6 players on Detroit that I think are worthy of scoring touchdowns. So certainly think that Demont and Gibbs are both in play, and I don't have any problems with prioritizing them if you would like to prioritize them over stacking. They're not going to have heavy ownership at all. So if you want to go with either one of them, I think they're a great play. Nobody wants Freiermuth. Yeah, nobody wants Freiermuth. Mostly because people are playing Stone Smart, I think, which is a relatively smart decision. Shoot me. But Freiermuth, I actually wrote him up as an undervalued play over at Fantasy Life. I do think that he's a pretty good play. He did get a little bit more attention. His routes are very, very concise, and he gets a lot of catchable targets. And I think that this is a game where Pittsburgh will actually have to be pushing a little bit here. Stack the Broncos because you'll be at the game. Good for you. Happy for you. I know that you really enjoy going to the games. I have not been to a actual football game in 20 years, I think. I should probably go to one here pretty soon. I know Pablo goes to Miami games.
I'm going to give you guys a hot take, which is that which is like going to football games actually sucks.
It does, yeah.
Like, go to a basketball game or go to a hockey game. Watch football at home. And I say that as somebody who does occasionally go to Dolphins games, but they're not. Just football's better at home.
Yeah, I agree. Watch it from the couch.
Yep.
And then Browns D is also not sneaky. I mean, I don't care if it's sneaky. I think so. Here's the thing. I think that more people will play the Panthers defense. I'm almost positive that more people will play the Panthers defense because there's going to be a shit ton of people playing Chuba Hubbard. But I do think the Browns defense is going to end up 15% owned, and I don't care about at 2,200. That's the thing with defense, right? Like, if you end up eating the chalk of a $3,100 defense, that feels awful. Or if you eat a 36% owned defense, that feels awful, right? But if there's a defense that's 2,200 and I can pair them with a $5,500 running back for extra added correlation, and they're only 15% owned, and that combo by itself, combinatoric ownership there is nothing, I don't care if the Browns defense is going to have some ownership. At 2,200, I think that ownership is likely justified. Whereas the Panthers defense is likely going to be popular because they are paired with Chuba Hubbard. So you guys have anything to say about the Browns defense or defense chalk in general?
I don't really give a shit if the Browns defense is chalky or not, because they're 2,200 and I don't know how much Chiefs care about this game, and they're missing their left tackle, and they have Myles Garrett going across them in a position that's kind of random, and I'm already playing a bunch of leverage in my stacks. So I will probably have mostly Browns defense this week, and I'm fine with that.
Same.
It's been nice knowing you, Pablo.
I gotta play some abs stacks to make up for it.
Cancel it out. Pay up and go Ravens defense. I wouldn't mind that. If you can find the salary to get to the Ravens defense, terrific. I personally do not think that I am going to be able to get there, but I do love Derrick Henry, and I do love pairing Derrick Henry with defense that he is playing for, because his outcomes are heavily correlated to whether a team wins or not. So I don't have a problem
James,
with that.
James, I want to give you one thing that you didn't say that I want to put out there because I just built the large field. I'm building some like larger field lineups this week, so I'm either gonna come in first or I'm gonna look really weird in these small fields I play. But a little double tight end with Trey McBride, Hunter Henry's in play this week. Just want to point that out.
Yeah, I'd buy that.
You've been the double tight end guy.
I don't mind it this way. It makes sense if you're playing Stone Smart, who's damn near min price, and like once you get to the flex position, sort the flex position by median and ceiling. Trey McBride is up there with anybody in our projection. The name, so it makes perfect sense. Like if you want to go Trey McBride, like in the flex, and you're going double tight end with a punt tight end.
Yeah,
and McBride.
And the other thing I want to say that again is that like instead of playing Chuba Hubbard in the Panthers defense, play Rico Dowdle and play Adam Thielen. So just want to say that.
Yeah. Here's the last thing that I'll say, and then we'll do some closing thoughts here. Don't stack the Jets. That's my last thing. I think that
very on brand.
No matter what people want to justify or whatever, like if you play Aaron Rodgers, who has not had a GPP winning outcome since 2020, has not had 300 plus yards and 3+ TDs in the same game in 4 years, retired in those 4 years, did ayahuasca in a basement for 4 days straight in those 4 years, and doesn't give a shit about the team that he's playing on anymore and is likely going to have a role in the government under the health administration this time next year. You do your thing, but you should, if you give a shit about your money in your bankroll, you should not play the Jets. That's a very silly thing to do. And this is coming from somebody who's been attacking the Jaguars since people talked about attacking the Jaguars, right? Like I've been talking about it since like week 3. So I think that it would be a very bad decision. And here's the thing, like as of now, we are seeing that Aaron Rodgers is not having any ownership, right? It's projected at 2% ownership. That shit's going to come in at like 8 or 9% ownership tomorrow. He's going to have some ownership. He's going to be like the 4th, maybe 5th highest owned quarterback tomorrow. And we're going to see a massive jump in ownership of both Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams on top of, let's see, where are they right now? I don't think that they project for high ownership right now either. Devontae Adams at 5% owned. Like, I think he comes in at like 10% owned tomorrow. We're going to see the jumps because I think that RPS is talking about him. And I know that 1 Week Season talked about him. And I'm going to guess the DTR on their established millions talked about him a little bit. Don't do it. Don't buy into it. Just stand strong. Don't play Jets bet. That's I think probably my final thing here. But Tribe, do you have any closing thoughts here?
Yeah. Baltimore, Detroit, Buffalo, and Washington, who we didn't talk about, like are 4 of the 5 teams with the highest totals on the slate. And they're not showing up in optimals. They're not showing up in like, just find a way to play them. Like, I don't want to see all of the mega tilts. Why did we not play the team playing the Giants who suck and play to score 30 points? I don't know why you didn't play one of Lamar Jackson or Derrick Henry, bruh. But you probably should have. So I'm telling you now, focus on teams and play to score a ton of points.
Yep. Pablo, you got any closing thoughts here?
No, I mean, I you guys hit it. I mean, play the high total games. Don't be afraid of the fact that they're lower owned. Look at that as a positive. I mean, you get into these situations sometimes in DFS where you have a lineup with a cumulative ownership that's pretty low, and you ask yourself, like, am I approaching this in a way that's smart or in a way that's dumb? And I think this week I'm willing to die on the hill of we're playing good games with high upside at lower ownership than higher ownership in middling games. Again, don't be smart about it. Like, it's okay to eat some running back chop. Like, you don't need to get leverage at every position, but lean into those high game totals And don't be afraid of low cumulative ownership. Look at that as a positive, not as a negative.
Yeah, I'm gonna add some closing thoughts here on top of what I just said, talking shit about the Jets. I think that this slate, once you talk about it and once you think through it in the way that we just did through this slate, I think that it makes a lot more sense and it's a lot easier to digest. Slates where there is not much value to really eat, they can be a little bit daunting because you end up having to make bad decisions. But you make the bad decisions because what you're doing is trying to force something to happen rather than just saying, oh, this is a pretty easy spot to just pay attention to and just go with it. I don't necessarily feel comfortable overstacking Detroit Buffalo because I don't know who's going to score the points there. But the idea is that somebody's going to score a shit ton of points there. So I should probably just have exposure. Even if the medians are relatively low, the ceilings are very high for that game environment. So focusing on things like that, I think, is really important. Also, just one last thing that I did not mention. I also think that in talking shit about the Jets a whole bunch, that's a really easy matchup, not only for their passing game, but for their running game as well. So if you want to get a little bit different with it, like so long as he plays, we can get some Breece Hall at 6,400. I think is a terrific play. And he did show up in the pivot finder, but just make sure that he plays first. If he doesn't, I think that Braylon Allen is a good play again. This has been the Slate Talk. I'm going to cut us off now because we are at an hour and 20 minutes. We went a little over, but this has been put on by Paydirt DFS. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate all the support. If you guys have a subscription over at Paydirt DFS already, then that's awesome. Love you. Thank you. If you don't, I think you should go get one. You get access to all the models that I showed off here and more for all the different sports, main sports, esports, niche sports, whole bunch of different things there. Really, really good value. And we also have weekly and day passes available if you just want to try some things out. So go try things out. Go check out subscription member stuff under the membership tab here. You can also join the Discord, free to join. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me at Paydirt_DFS on Twitter or in the Discord, which again is free to join. This has been joined by Tribe and by Pablo. You can reach out to them in the Discord as well. They'll answer any questions you got. But yeah, thank you guys so much for showing up. Appreciate it. And let's go get some trophies.